What if I told you that your medieval ancestors faced something that makes our recent pandemic look like a mild inconvenience? What if surviving meant choosing between drinking contaminated water or dying of thirst? What if your government literally nailed your door shut with your family inside? Welcome to the Black Death, where 1 in 3 people didn't make it out alive, where rats were the real enemy, but nobody knew it, and where survival depended on decisions that would seem absolutely insane today. Ready to find out if you'd make it? Let's dive into the medieval nightmare that redefined what social distancing really means. So, imagine living in a bustling medieval city. Maybe it's London, Paris, or Florence. Doesn't matter. What matters is that these cities had over 10,000 people crammed together like sardines in a can that smells like sewage and regret. Here's the thing about medieval cities. They were basically plague superhighways. Rats could literally hop from roof to roof, house to house, spreading their tiny hitchhiking fleas like the world's worst Uber service. And those fleas, they were carrying a bacterial passenger that would kill 1 in 3 Europeans between 1347 and 1351. 1 in 3. That's not a statistic. That's neighbors, family members, drinking buddies at the tavern. Gone. Most people first heard about this great mortality from some wild-eyed traveler stumbling into town squares, ranting about entire cities turning into ghost towns, because that's how news traveled back then, through traumatized merchants who'd watched whole populations vanish faster than your Wi-Fi during a Zoom call. And if a city happened to be on a major trade route, congratulations, they just won the medieval lottery of death. Those merchant ships pulling into harbors weren't just bringing exotic spices and silk. They were bringing rats, lots of rats, rats carrying fleas, fleas carrying plague. The irony? A city's economic success basically guaranteed it would be among the first to die. But here's what really gets me. Medieval doctors were about as useful as a chocolate teapot. They had absolutely no clue that rats and fleas were the problem. Instead, they blamed bad air, which they called miasma, and God's righteous anger at humanity's sins. Imagine going to WebMD and being told your symptoms are caused by vibes and divine displeasure. That was medieval medicine in a nutshell. But before the mass dying began, there were signs. Weird, unsettling signs that everyone noticed, but nobody understood. If people knew what to look for, they might have had a head start on survival. You know that feeling when your pet starts acting strange before a thunderstorm? Well, medieval animals had a similar sixth sense about incoming doom, except instead of hiding from lightning, they were trying to escape a bacterial apocalypse. First, the cats and dogs started dropping dead. Just randomly. One day, they're normal. The next day, they're corpses in the street. And the rats? Oh, the rats started doing something that should have made everyone's medieval alarm bells ring. They stumbled out into broad daylight, disoriented and dying. Rats hate daylight. They're basically the vampires of the rodent world. When rats start having midday dance parties in town squares, something is seriously wrong. Then came the smell. People would be walking through their neighborhoods when this weird, sickly sweet stench would hit them. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. People blamed it on corrupted air or swamp gas. Reality check. It was the smell of bodies already starting to pile up in houses where entire families were dying behind closed doors. But the real nightmare began when the first human victims appeared. Picture the most painful swollen lymph node anyone's ever had. Now multiply that by 1,000 and imagine it turning black. These buboes, basically plague-swollen glands, erupted in people's necks, armpits, and groin like some horrific medieval version of bubble wrap that nobody wanted to pop. The timeline was brutal, 2 to 7 days from first symptoms to death. Most people died from internal bleeding or their lungs basically drowning in their own fluids. Medieval medicine's response? Bloodletting. Because apparently when someone is dying from internal bleeding, the logical solution is to make them bleed more externally. Chef's kiss to medieval logic right there. And here's where things got really dark. Families started hiding their sick relatives. Because word on the medieval street was that some cities had started boarding up infected houses with everyone inside. Sick or healthy, didn't matter. If plague got in someone's house, that house became their tomb. Imagine being perfectly healthy, but locked inside with dying family members because neighbors spotted one person coughing. So, when faced with this nightmare scenario, what actually worked? Turns out some medieval survival strategies were accidentally brilliant for all the wrong reasons. Let's talk about the medieval equivalent of, I'm getting the hell out of here. Rich people had this survival strategy down to an art form. The moment, and I mean the moment, they heard plague rumors, they packed up their golden goblets and expensive tapestries and fled to their countryside estates faster than you can say social distancing. This wasn't just wealthy privilege flexing. This was the single most effective survival strategy available. Because here's the thing, plague spread through cities like wildfire, but it had a much harder time chasing people into rural areas with low population density. Rich medieval folks basically invented remote work 700 years early. Meanwhile, the people stuck in cities started figuring out some survival tactics that accidentally worked for reasons they didn't understand. Take crowd avoidance. Medieval people noticed that plague spread faster in markets, churches, and festivals, so they started avoiding these gatherings like they were medieval Comic-Con during flu season. They thought they were avoiding bad air. In reality, they were avoiding fleas jumping between people and reducing airborne transmission from coughing plague victims. Then, there were the plague doctors with their absolutely ridiculous leather beak masks stuffed with herbs and spices. These guys looked like medieval nightmare birds, and everyone thought the herbs were protecting them from corrupted air. Plot twist, the herbs did nothing. But those massive leather beaks, they accidentally kept fleas from landing on the doctors' faces. Sometimes being wrong for the right reasons is better than being right for the wrong reasons. People also started burning the clothes and bedding of plague victims. Their reasoning? Evil spirits or corrupted air or whatever medieval explanation made sense at the time. The reality? They were torching flea habitats and breaking the transmission cycle. Medieval people, accidentally genius, consistently clueless about why. And then some cities got really hardcore with their survival tactics. They started banning entry to outsiders completely. Ships had to sit in harbors for 40 days before anyone could disembark. This is literally where we get the word quarantine from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. Cities that went full lockdown mode had significantly lower death rates. Medieval Venice basically invented border control and saved thousands of lives in the process. But for every city that managed to keep the plague out, dozens more watched their entire civilization collapse in real time. And when I say collapse, I mean total societal breakdown. Remember how I said 1 in 3 people died? Well, that's the overall European average. Some cities lost 60% of their population. 60%. Imagine waking up tomorrow and 6 out of every 10 people around are just gone. Now here's where things get really dystopian. City governments didn't just struggle to cope with the crisis, they straight up ceased to exist. Mayors, judges, tax collectors, city council members. They all either died or noped out of there faster than parents abandoning a screaming toddler in a grocery store. Who's going to collect taxes when the tax collector is dead? Who's going to settle disputes when the judge fled to the countryside? Who's going to maintain order when the guards are either dead or protecting their own families? Nobody. That's who. The people responsible for burying the dead started demanding 10 times their normal wages. And honestly, fair. Would anyone want to handle plague corpses for minimum wage? Gravediggers became medieval essential workers with hazard pay, except instead of getting PPE, they got premium compensation and the very real possibility of joining their customers. Churches ran out of space for individual burials and started digging mass graves that looked like medieval landfills, but for humans. Some places just started dumping bodies into abandoned wells or pushing them into rivers. Environmental protection laws weren't exactly a priority when civilization was crumbling. Entire family businesses disappeared overnight because, well, entire families disappeared overnight. Shops sat empty with their doors hanging open like dead mouths. No one to inherit, no one to collect debts, no one to keep the medieval economy running. And when law enforcement evaporates, when the social contract breaks down, people started breaking into abandoned houses like it was Black Friday, but for survival supplies. Food, money, warm clothes, anything that might help them make it through another day. Some neighborhoods organized their own vigilante groups to maintain some semblance of order. Medieval neighborhood watch programs, except instead of watching for petty crime, they were watching for plague symptoms and desperate neighbors with nothing left to lose. But let's say someone survived the initial chaos. Congratulations, they're now living in a post-apocalyptic nightmare where every decision could literally be life or death. So how exactly do people stay alive when everything they knew about normal life has completely fallen apart? Welcome to medieval survival mode, where every sip of water could kill someone and every piece of food might be their last meal. First priority, water. But not just any water. People had to boil absolutely everything because dead bodies were contaminating wells faster than medieval Yelp reviews could warn people. Plague victims were being dumped into water sources either accidentally or because desperate people ran out of places to put corpses. Drinking unboiled water during a plague outbreak was basically playing Russian roulette with a bacterial bullet. Food became a whole different nightmare. Fresh meat? Forget about it. Without proper preservation and with supply chains completely destroyed, meat spoiled faster than a medieval influencer's career. Dried grains became the currency of survival. Wheat, barley, anything that could last months without going bad. People started hoarding food like medieval preppers, except instead of waiting for the apocalypse, they were living through it. And money? Money became about as useful as a chocolate fireplace. Coins could carry fleas, banks closed when their owners died, and what good is currency when there's nothing to buy and nobody alive to sell it? Bartering made a comeback harder than low-rise jeans in 2023. People traded whatever they had for whatever they needed. A warm cloak for a bag of grain, a knife for medical herbs, a horse for safe passage out of the city. Children learned skills that would traumatize modern kids. They were taught to recognize plague symptoms in themselves and others because accidental contact with an infected person meant entire families could be dead within a week. Medieval children became tiny plague detectives, examining people for swollen lymph nodes like their lives depended on it, because their lives literally depended on it. And here's a survival tip that actually makes sense. Nighttime became the safest time to move around cities. Fleas are less active in cold temperatures, so darkness provided a small measure of protection. Medieval people accidentally discovered that vampire hours were survival hours. Plus, there were fewer people around to accidentally infect others because most of them were either dead or hiding indoors, praying to whatever gods they thought might still be listening. Now, if someone somehow managed to survive all of this, the initial outbreak, the social collapse, the daily nightmare of just staying alive, they'd eventually face the strangest twist of all. Because when the dying finally stopped, something completely unexpected happened to the survivors. Here's the most twisted irony of the entire Black Death. The people who survived often ended up richer than they'd ever dreamed possible. Think about it logically. When 30-60% of the population dies, what happens to all their stuff? Their houses, their land, their jobs, their businesses? It doesn't just disappear into the medieval ether. It gets redistributed among the survivors. Suddenly, there were way more resources than people to use them. Property values dropped like a medieval stock market crash, but in reverse, instead of everyone losing money, the survivors gained everything. Labor became scarce as unicorns. If people were alive and capable of working, they could literally name their price. Surviving workers started demanding higher wages, better working conditions, and actual job security from employers who were desperate enough to agree to almost anything. Imagine walking into a boss's office and saying, "I want double my salary, 3 weeks vacation, and my own office." Or, "I'm walking." Except instead of the boss laughing them out of the building, they're like, "Done, please don't leave. You're one of 7 people left who knows how to do this job." The Black Death accidentally invented workers' rights 600 years before unions became a thing. Some plague survivors developed immunity, which made them incredibly valuable as nurses and caregivers during future outbreaks. These people became medieval superheroes, immune to the thing that killed everyone else, able to help without fear of infection. But perhaps the most lasting change was urban planning. Cities that rebuilt after the plague learned some hard lessons about overcrowding and sanitation. New laws required wider streets, better sewage systems, and limits on building density. Medieval city planners basically invented urban health codes because they'd seen what happened when too many people were crammed together with inadequate infrastructure. They didn't understand bacteria or disease transmission, but they understood that cramped, dirty cities became death traps. The massive population loss changed European society forever. The feudal system, where peasants were basically property tied to the land, started crumbling because lords needed to attract workers with actual incentives like freedom and wages instead of just owning them. When survival is rare, survivors become valuable. When workers are scarce, workers gain power. The Black Death accidentally kick-started social mobility and workers' rights centuries ahead of schedule. So there's your guide to surviving medieval plague in an overcrowded city, where success meant making choices that would seem absolutely insane by today's standards, but were actually brilliantly logical for their time. Which of these medieval survival strategies surprised you the most? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you enjoyed this historical nightmare, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories about how our ancestors survived impossible situations. Because if they could survive the Black Death with medieval medicine, imagine what we can handle today.